Hello, everyone, and welcome to Guildmaster Gaming. Today, I'm talking with Cavan Campbell about his film Through the Throat. This is a nice little micro short, less than 10 minutes long, that's going to be screening at Film Quest later on this year. I've had the opportunity to watch it, and I'll be writing up a review. But today, we're talking with you, Cavan, about his film. So, Cavan, please introduce yourself and tell us what you'd like about Through the Throat.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, first of all. Yes, my name is Cavan Campbell. I'm a writer and a film director based in Toronto, Canada. Yeah, and I'm going to be at Film Quest at the end of October with my psychological horror short, Through the Throat, which follows unhappily middle-aged Janine, who is discovering that the internal demon, we might say, that she's been dealing with in the aftermath of breakup is proving to be much more real today than she had anticipated.
Great little synopsis. I like that. So now as we're on to the film, we kind of got that visual that it's something more internal. What was your inspiration for Through the Throat?
Um, well, probably the best way, and I hope this isn't going to be too triggering for people, to describe it is that though it's not a film about a pandemic, it is absolutely my pandemic film. Um, I had just been through a rather bad breakup with a romantic partner. Um, that happened about a year into the pandemic, and a story that I'm sure was repeated in tons of relationships around the time. That largely it was the circumstances of the pandemic that unfortunately led to our breakup. So, in the aftermath of dealing with that and thinking about issues surrounding my own life, issues of isolation, issues of frustration I was having, as I'm sure everybody can relate to around that time, that so much of our expectations for our lives and our usual activities, people we'd spend time with and things we'd spend time doing had all been narrowed by the very nature of this medical emergency that we were all dealing with. And I spent a lot of time sort of stewing in that, or in the four walls of my apartment. And I realized that more than anything I had been dealing with in my life up to that point, this felt like the actual internal terminology of a horror film that I was living through, very much in an emotional and a psychological sense, of course, as opposed to physical. But it really struck me that this was something pervasive that just about everybody in the world, by times in that first year and a half, was in the process of dealing with. Like everybody's life had, to a certain degree, become a bit of a horror film inside their own heads and inside their own bodies. And on realizing that and unpacking some of my feelings about that, I realized that there was probably something worth exploring here um, in terms of exploring a personality at exactly that end of the road and sort of what that level of isolation means for somebody who has had such a vacuum forcibly instilled upon their life.
Okay, so kind of in a terms for those that have been in writing that for a long time, they always hear write what you know. And that's exactly what you did is you took on that whole premise and this is what I know and got it down there. The other part about it too, I think that I've talked with people about on this kind of segment, it's write what you know, but the one thing about genre writers especially is we turn a different reflective mirror on life that we understand. And in this case, you decide to use the darker mirror of horror to express that. Is horror where you usually go with what you write and what you create?
In the last several years and last several projects, certainly, it's not really the lens that I started out making films through and writing scripts through, but I would say in probably the last 5 or 6 years, it's something that's really come to light me on fire for very much the reason that you're alluding to, that there is, this dark mirror through which genre storytelling can be used to think about the world and our lives and what goes on in the interface between them. Um, Probably the biggest thing that started to excite me several years ago about genre filmmaking and particularly horror films is the realization that horror can be nearly anything, right? It doesn't, a lot of people have this mindset that horror filmmaking defaults to some kind of vision of slasher films and gore. And of course, those are a lot of fun and they exist. But there's much more emotional and psychological and internal terminology that can be used when exploring horror. I mean, horror is very much, I think, a hyphenate genre that has a habit, is vampiristic kind of habit of being able to drink from a lot of different related genres around the side. And I think horror filmmaking in particular, horror storytelling, excites me so much because there's such a wide palette of metaphor and imagery that can be used to talk about real life far more than exists when you're making a simple kitchen sink drama.
Yeah, years ago I attended a panel at a conference and it was horror versus gore. And I think that sums up what you're saying right there. So many people are expecting the slasher and the gore, where there's horror, which is actually the building of dread and suspense and all the other elements, not just splatter. So yeah. So what genre were you working in before, or what genre did you like to work in or prefer working in?
Uh, Probably like a lot of filmmakers, I started off working in the range of drama, very much in terms of kitchen sink drama. Um, as you alluded to, write what you know. I think a lot of storytellers at the beginning of their careers have perhaps a little more prosaic an outlook in terms of the type of genres they can work in and are interested in working in on the basis of just the content and the quality of their lives to that point. And I enjoyed it quite a lot. I made several films that I'm still quite proud of. But I think when I pushed beyond those kind of boundaries and started looking at removing the genre from the type of references from my own life I want to make, and having them be separated by a gulf of tonality, I think my work started to get a little more exciting, at least to me, and I think I started to have the ability to talk in more complicated terms about the world around me, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It makes total sense. I can kind of relate. I was actually trying to write in science fiction and fantasy realms and couldn't get published. And I was challenged by another author to write a horror. And it was like, I'd never done horror. And goes, that's why you should do it. Absolutely no expectations. And it was the first published piece I got. So it's kind of like what you're saying right there. It's kind of provides that different aspect. So in looking back at Through the Throat, uh, it could be seen that this, I mean, let's first go back to this. You're at FilmQuest, but whereabouts are you in your festival run? Or is this the beginning, the middle, the end? Whereabouts do you think you're at?
This is the very beginning. FilmQuest is actually going to be our second festival engagement.
Okay.
Um, And so, yeah, it's at the very beginning. So I've got a big dumb grin on my face right now because I'm looking forward to what comes next. And this is, and the reality being, you know, to touch back on the era of the pandemic briefly, my previous film, Receiver, which was another psychological horror film, which also actually played at Film Quest,
Which is very good if
was,
anybody wants to check it out, if you can find it. Very good film.
thank you so much. But that film was finished exactly 3 days before Toronto ended up in mandated lockdown. In this would be spring of 2020, and so our entire festival run was entirely composed of virtual film festivals, including FilmQuest that year. And I do need to say, especially to the organizers of FilmQuest, they did an excellent job. I know it was an exceptionally tough 2 years for festivals to try and figure out a way to maintain engagement between audiences and filmmakers when everybody was sort of in their own pockets of isolation. But at the end of the day, there's still ultimately something that's a little missed by not being able to be there in person, interacting with an audience in a theater space, interacting with other filmmakers. So the other level of excitement I have right now at the beginning of our festival run for Through the Throat is that this is the first time in about 8 years that I'm actually able to go out and festival in person because my previous film had to be done entirely digitally and virtually.
Yeah. I do understand that there's something always fun about watching the reaction of an audience, seeing if the right cues, the right beats are hit, and all that sort of fun. So, in Through the Throat, one thing that could be said about this is like you're saying, it's this cathartic kind of moving on from a relationship, which gives us the point that it could be seen as a sense of an origin story. So, on that basis, are you looking at this as being a possible, like, a launch into a larger film?
Directly, no, but indirectly, very much so. So the entire story, the entire setting of the nature of Janine's life and what she's going through in terms of her health and what she's going through in terms of her internal transformation that's happening over the course of Through the Throat was very much designed to be a very small, very precise look at a very specific type of character. But, and I hope I'm not spoiling things too much, the exploration of vampirism that I'm tackling in Through the Throat is very much something that I'm exploring in a feature film script that I'm writing right now. Part of the reason being that in the last couple of years I've gotten really excited about the concept of unpacking sort of historical horror monsters and trying to find interesting ways to recontextualize the rules of those creatures in ways that we don't necessarily expect and don't necessarily see as the base setting for what we expect in a in a vampire picture or a zombie picture or a wolfman picture or something like that. Not to suggest I'm working with zombies or wolfmen right now, but I'm in the process of working on a feature vampire script that jumps off from the sort of rules of vampirism that are threaded, admittedly very subtly, through the throat, and trying to unpack that on a much larger palette and much larger exploration of what that means for the slice of humanity that I'm taking a look at through that lens.
I just from what you're hearing, I have an author friend here in Salt Lake that has been doing kind of this. Let you go there for a moment. That's been doing kind of the same thing, is because he was so tired of how all the monsters are portrayed, and he's like this monster person, uh, uh, dealing with all these. He's created a series of looking at the development of vampires to children. So it's a middle grade series books starting in Salem, Massachusetts, and how they lived through time coming up and dealing with it. And some of the things you were saying is the same thing as he was saying is vampires don't have to be evil. It's just they get tagged that way. So
Absolutely. And the interesting thing, and in the lead up to writing Through the Throat, and also this other script, the feature that I'm working on right now, I ended up doing a lot of historical research on historical vampire mythology
mhm.
pre Stoker, going back to like 13th century Europe, and there's some very fascinating
Oh
stuff.
yeah.
Um, there ends up being actually a lot of overlap in that era between historically how and culturally how vampires and werewolves were viewed at the time, and there was a lot of overlap in terms of the rules of the creatures and their creation and how they live their lives and how they interact with people, with societies, with their former family members, um, and it's unfortunate, but also an exciting jumping off point that so much of how we think about the nature of vampires as a creature and as a mythology right now owes so very much to Bram Stoker's work in Dracula, which is not surprising. It still remains an excellent piece of literature, but there are these expectations of there being this historical lineage of some of these rules that have no historical lineage at all, that actually just began with Dracula and got so ingrained within the cultural understanding of what vampires are and what they mean and how they work that we think of it as the default now. And going back and doing research that predates that by several hundred years really opened up some interesting and very, very exciting and kind of scary opportunities for ways to tweak the mythology and deal with things in different and unexpected ways, to put a twist on what the expectations for vampires and the stories around them would be.
That sounds like a lot of fun kind of moving forward. Uh, I hope that kind of goes because kind of ties in as we're always talking with people about future projects, and it sounds like this is one that's got your excitement up that you really want to see if you can make it. So,
Very much so. I just have to find the time to finish the script right now. But that's coming. Hopefully this winter I'll get a sustained chunk of time to just bang some words out.
okay. So kind of looking in your to your past, you've become a filmmaker. What was your inspiration? When was it that, or something you saw or read, whatever it was, that went, that's what I want to do. I want to be a filmmaker.
Well, perhaps a little unconventionally, I would argue both of my parents are to blame for this. My mother is a writer, retired now, although she worked in the realm of nonfiction almost exclusively. And my father is a retired architect and has been a painter his entire life. So between visual art and writing, you kind of smush those two things together, and somehow in the mix, cinema comes out of it. So there was always this idea when I was growing up that the idea of the spoken word and color and shape and visual expression were were pretty inherent parts of the human experience and of life, and that this was potentially a way forward, even though I grew up in the middle of nowhere in very rural Eastern Canada, that this was more than just something that could be a hobby, that this could potentially be a career. And it also helped that my father is a massive film buff, and so when my siblings and I were children, we'd be, propped up at 3 in the morning to watch movies late night with them on CBC. So it was just this osmotic sort of influence that I think spread through my entire youth. And, by the time I was around, I would say 9 or 10, I I was so in love with movies and with the idea of cinema and that kind of expression, even though, to be clear, as a 10-year-old, I didn't really understand the full concept of what cinema was and is. But I became absolutely convinced at that point that I wanted to be a film director, even though I had only the most tenuous idea what a film director actually does.
So going back through all those years, and I'm sure it goes back to then, but also much further, what were some of the more influential films for you?
Well, some of the initial big ticket influences, if you consider the era that I grew up, which is the mid to late 80s and early 90s, were perhaps unsurprisingly the original Star Wars trilogy and the Indiana Jones trilogy. Unsurprisingly, the oeuvre of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg were very big around that time for kids my age. So those were a set of 6 movies that I watched constantly. I would argue almost obsessively into my teenage years, um, to the point that I was watching them trying to consistently, even though I don't think I really knew what I was doing at the time, I was consistently trying to find new ways of looking at them, not only just thinking of them as stories or fun romps that involved Harrison Ford, who was of course my favorite actor at the time, but looking at how shots were put together, how editing worked. I mean, even though I only had the haziest idea of what any of these individual sort of arts that make up film, what they were and how they come together, I think by obsessively sort of rewatching that work, I was forcing myself to over the course of several years be forced to see it through different eyes rather consistently. So those were some of the big ones, and then back to things I can blame my father for. I would argue by the time I became a teenager, some of the biggest influences in terms of my understanding of storytelling and what types of stories I wanted to tell were a lot of American and British films from the 40s through the 70s that he introduced me to. I mean, he's the reason why I have such a love for film noir. Um, he introduced me to, I mean, in one way or another, basically all of what are now my favorite films. Um, and we'd be watching Hitchcock movies and old Powell and Pressburger films, Howard Hawks films, and old studio era pictures from the 40s and 50s, David Lean movies. So there was a lot of that sort of early mid era of English language cinema that then became sort of the real driving factor for my interest in looking at how films are made and how those stories are told.
Okay, I can consider that. Yeah, those are all great stuff there. So, in looking forward, you've got your feature that you're trying to work on, getting that written up of the vampires. Do you have any other projects that you've kind of got in the works that people might be able to look forward to?
Well, I have another feature that's written right now. It's a chamber horror film. Entitled Freight All Kinds that follows three high school students over their senior year Christmas break who are trapped inside a shipping container being sent far inland by rail, and who have to struggle to survive the circumstances and grow up very, very quickly under terrible, terrible odds. That's something that I've gotten in development right now. And I'm also at the relatively early stages of developing a sort of, how should I put this, a sci-fi Eastern television series that is set in the near future of the environmental pre-apocalypse, we might say, in future Prince Edward Island, which is where I grew up. So it's very much an East Coast Western, we might say, that's set in the near future. That's as I get the chance to spool that up, is hopefully going to be an opportunity to look at, some of my rather consistent thoughts about issues of environmentalism and immigration and pervasiveness of technology. So between those three projects, I'm probably going to have my hands full for the immediate future, I think.
Okay, that sounds like you got a lot on the burners there, kind of cooking out. So let me kind of throw it one step higher than that. If Cavan Campbell had the opportunity to work on his dream project, no matter what it was, where it was at, what would that dream project be?
Oh boy. Honestly, the probably, if I'm being honest and not jumping the gun too much right now, what I would give just about anything to work on would be an adaptation of Michael Ondaatje's novel Anel's Ghost. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Ondaatje's work. He's a Sri Lankan Canadian filmmaker, or sorry, Sri Lankan Canadian author. And Anel's Ghost is we might call it a forensic murder mystery that's set during about the middle of the 30-year Sri Lankan Civil War. It's a story that's quite important to me, as well as being phenomenally well written. It's a story that is in many ways directly connected to some of my family history because I'm Sri Lankan Canadian. And one of the reasons why we lost touch with so many of our cousins and aunts and uncles during the 80s and 90s was due very much to the Civil War. And when we were kids, my parents had said that they were not going to take us to a country that was in the middle of civil strife. Um, and it meant that there was a whole part of my heritage during a really formative series of years that I missed out on the chance of really experiencing to quite the degree that I am so hungry to have now. Um, and to be clear, I don't mean to suggest that my family story is the biggest tragedy of the Sri Lankan Civil War. It was an awful conflict, and the people who were living there at the time uh, lived through terrible circumstances. So I know our family trauma is very minor in the history of that era of Sri Lanka's past, but it's still something that I think, in terms of the hunger and the cultural interest that I have as an adult now, is very instrumental to what sort of burns inside me. And I think there is a truly heartbreaking and fascinating and exciting film that is out there just waiting to be made about Annel's ghost, and I would give just about anything to be the person who got the chance to bring it to the screen.
Well, maybe the right person will be watching this and hear that and reach out to you, because that's I have known a couple of people from Sri Lanka, and I understand what you're saying there. It's an emotional aspect whenever you're dealing with family history too. So that sounds really amazing. So what we've got, I'm kind of getting towards the end here on certain things, but if people wanted to follow you, where would they find you out there on the web?
Uh, my least favorite question, because I am truly abysmal when it comes to social media. But the largest footprint that can be found, my production company is entitled Interlock Pictures. My website is www.interlockpictures, all one word, .com. And I'm on Instagram at Interlock Pictures, as well as on Facebook. Um, I really need to start being on those platforms a little more often. But those are sort of the main ways in which to follow me online. But I would argue, for any of your listeners and readers, if you're interested in getting in touch with me, honestly, probably one of the best ways is hit up my website and get in touch with me via email. I'm typically a little more responsive in that way, and honestly, I love having the chance to chat with interesting individuals and audience members and other storytellers. I mean, it's kind of one of the great things about being a filmmaker and a storyteller in the modern era, is just how much creative overlap and opportunities there are to interact with other people with the same kind of interests and hungers in terms of story and narrative and characters and films as myself.
I agree. It's a lot of fun kind of doing those sort of things. So with everything you've got going, everything kind of moving into the future, what do you like to do when you have some downtime so you can relax?
Oh boy, another not so great question, because the dirty little secret is, as a Canadian filmmaker, you never have downtime. But when I do have some time to myself, um, uh, this is going to sound pretty prosaic, but I'm actually quite an avid gardener. I love working in my garden. I'm a pretty big cyclist as well, so I love being on my bike. It's kind of one of my happy places. Um, I enjoy travel as well. Of course, back to the whole nature of the pandemic. Travel kind of got squelched for a couple of years, but now, some opportunities are opening up, and cultural travel and just having the chance to, bum around interesting countries and interesting cities and get the chance to experience different cultures, different personalities, different ways of life, is one of the things that I think, to use a cliche, kind of feeds my soul.
I can understand that. I'm totally with you on that, on getting around and seeing new cultures. It's great stuff. So I'm gonna prep you out for one and then ask you a different question. So I'm gonna give you a moment at the end to kind of call out any way you want, to anybody, anything. But right now, I want to ask you, you've got a lot of background. You, it sounds like you had a lot of support growing up to kind of pursue the artistic side of things. But if you had someone come up to you and say, "Hey, I want to become a filmmaker," what advice would you give them?
Probably the most useful advice that I ever got myself when I moved to Toronto and started studying film and started to work, you know, in the industry was that lots of people love film and love cinema. Much fewer of those people can only envision themselves doing that for their lives. It is a really tough row to hoe, so to speak. Especially in Canada right now, there is not a ton of money, and there's unfortunately a dwindling number of opportunities to get films made and to get them seen. Um, it's a hard life to take on full time. And so, what I would say is only do so if you can't envision being happy doing anything else with your life. If you are a misfit like myself who knows that there's only one path forward, then bury yourself in it and do everything you can, work as hard as you can, be as curious as you can about the world, and try and create opportunities for yourself. But if you can see yourself being happy doing anything else full time in your life, you should do that thing and keep filmmaking as a happy pastime that you get to enjoy when the circumstances are correct. Because then you won't have to deal with half the pain that I think most filmmakers, and if we're being honest, most artists just have to accept as a natural, if unfortunate, part of that existence. And I think the people who can weather that the best and most graciously and with the closest thing to a smile on their face are the people who know that it is the only way forward for them.
Yeah, I've talked with so many people, and it's kind of a joke in a sense, but it's like working with creative people is one of the few areas you can ask them. So, what do you do for your day job? And it's kind of going
Was
right.
that rhetorical or is that actually
No, that's
a
what I mean.
question to me?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to answer, you can, but I mean, that was kind of rhetorical. It's just one of those things that as creatives, we pretty much understand it's starting out is not going to be something that's going to, be paying your bills from day one. You have to kind of let it keep growing and building and like you said, gotta love it and do what you have to do in a sense on the sideline to make sure that you can follow through with your dreams.
Absolutely. I mean, I think any artistic endeavor you have got to love with every fiber of your being, because the truth is, it's not always going to love you back. Because there are so many circumstances, some coming down to things as pedantic as luck, but so many circumstances that are entirely outside of your control, and so you've got to love it in a way that is probably concerning to people outside your immediate family. And to answer your question, because I think being honest about these things is important, you're absolutely right. The reality is, I cannot pay all my bills full time by being a filmmaker in Canada. It is simply just not the way the industry is working in its current state. So I pay my bills, thankfully still working in the industry, but I work in lighting design. Toronto is a big hub for primarily American productions of film and television that are coming here to shoot, and I've been working in lighting for 20 years. So it pays the bills. Thankfully, I have enough of a skill set and enough seniority that I'm usually in demand to a certain degree. And I've been very lucky to work on some really exciting big budget projects that have been shooting for all intents and purposes in my backyard. But the reality is, as somebody who's been doing this for over 20 years now, the reality is I still can't make a living as a writer and a film director. I certainly hope to be able to shift that reality, but it's just not the way the circumstances in my home country um, allow life to work right now, except for a very rarefied few, unfortunately.
So I'm going to follow up on that, what you just said. You've had a chance to work on some big ticket items. Is there any that you can name drop or kind of let people know, kind of to see where your talent falls? And I know sometimes it's
Sure.
questionable that, so I don't want you to break any NDAs or anything.
Well, I mean, I'm between lighting projects right now, so I'm technically not under any NDAs at the moment. But I worked on the lighting team for all 5 seasons of Star Trek Discovery. For your listeners and your readers who are familiar with that, and most recently, I finished up a run working on the lighting team for Guillermo del Toro's new film, which is an adaptation of Frankenstein. That was very exciting. That basically took me from the end of last year up until late this summer, and that was a thoroughly exciting project to work on. Guillermo is a real visionary. I mean, that's a very pedantic thing to say that many smarter people than me have said over the years about his work. But having the chance to work arm's length with such a creative storyteller is a real treat because the reality is, 95% of what we mainly work on is a lot of rather anonymous television that where you don't get the chance to play at all of the artistic corners of the medium, and so it's always a really challenging and a really enjoyable thing to be lucky enough to work on a project with so many interesting creators.
That's great. In fact, I was just recently talking to someone in one of these interviews, and he was in the editing team for Del Toro. So it sounds like you've got quite a connection up there in Canada with what he's doing. So congratulations on that. So we're going to just kind of finish up here. Any final call outs that you would like to give about your film, about the people you work with, anything at all?
Well, I think the two individuals that I definitely want to call out, who were my two largest collaborators, creative collaborators on Through the Throat, is my the film's wonderful lead actress, who plays multiple roles in the film, Kimberly Ann Crosscup, who is a long friend of mine who I've known for 20 years and is a phenomenal stage actress that I was very lucky to work with on this project. And then also my honestly most common, most frequent creative collaborator, which is my writing and editing partner, Luke Higginson. Again, somebody else I've known since film school. Luke is a tremendous writer and editor, and also a truly wonderful film director of his own accord. For any of your viewers who have a chance to see Luke's feature debut, Relax, I'm from the Future, that was released last year. It is a truly hilarious comedy, a dirtbag time travel comedy that stars. Oh God, can we cut this out? I'm now drawing a complete blank on the
No,
lead
I,
actor's
I I
name.
actually know what film you're talking about. I stumbled across it and watched it on demand. And yeah, it's a fun film, and I'm the same way. Right now, I couldn't tell you who was in it. I can picture him. Uh,
The only excuse I can give, and now I clearly have to apologize to Luke. The only excuse I can give is that I'm getting over a 3-week flu, so my brain is perhaps still a little hazy. Point being, for any of your readers and listeners out there, if you get a chance to check out Luke's film, Relax, I'm from the Future, it is absolutely going to be worth your while. The only risk is that you may split your stomach from laughing.
let's see if we can find it real here quick. Yeah, it came out in 22 and stars Race Darby, Gabriel Graham, and Julian
Reese
Richard.
Darby, there we go. Good Lord, Reese Darby. How I feel ashamed that I forgot that. But yes, Relax, I'm from the Future, starring Reese Darby. He is an absolute gas in the film. Luke directs the hell out of it. He also wrote the film. It's a wonderful hour and a half to spend, and anybody who hears my voice droning on about this should endeavor to check it out.
Well, thank you for being with us. And I want to thank everybody else for joining us on this episode as we talk with Cavan. And please get to the festivals and check out Cavan's work, Through the Throat. It's a short film, less than 10 minutes, but it has a good punch. And I was going to ask about this, and going on to other things, totally forgot. The opening scene with the lowering of the bed. I thought that was, we've already talked that it's a vampire. I thought that was just a great little call out to the idea of the opening of the coffin that you see so many times. So a lot of fun there. So it has some good elements to it in the storytelling that I think people can enjoy. So like I say, please get out and check out your independent filmmakers, independent writers, the independent artists. It's where the creativity is really coming from. You can see so many great things out there. Um, and again, if you enjoyed this, please like it and share it. If you want to, subscribe so we can do more of this. It makes it easier. Thank you, Cavan, for being with us.
Thank you so much. I do just quickly want to say for your audience that I'm going to be at FilmQuest in person for the last
Okay.
4 days. So for anybody who comes out and join, please seek me out. I'd love to have a chat. It's one of my favorite things about attending festivals. And also, Through the Throat is going to be screening Halloween night, October 31st at 8 p.m.
Okay.
So please check it out.
Hopefully I can get this up before then because I've got so much going on. All
I
right.
hope so.
We'll talk to everybody soon. And I'll see you at
Thank
FilmQuest.
you so much again.